want you to think about everything that could happen today. Think about the to-do list that you have, the different decisions you have to make. How will they go? How could they go? Imagine just one of those decisions. Take a moment, if you can, and write down a couple of options, a couple of ways that decision could go, and assign probabilities to each of those outcomes. This information that you are generating is incredibly nuanced, but it's also incredibly valuable. And getting really good about thinking about these kinds of probabilities could totally change your life and your career. But I can almost guarantee you're missing something, and we're going to talk about what that is in today's episode. My name is Jonathan Cottrell. You're listening to Developer T. My goal on this show is to help driven developers like you find clarity, perspective, and purpose in their careers. As we've talked about many times on this show, trying to make a decision is an exercise. It's an exercise in trying to predict the future. You imagine that you have some intended outcome and that you want the decision to produce that outcome. Now, we know, of course, we've talked about this even recently on the show and in the distant past, that outcomes are not always indicative of a good decision. We talked about this in the last episode, actually. And a good decision is not determined based on the outcome for a given instance. Over time, if you make statistically good decisions, if you make decisions that are in your favor, then your decision should match the profile of those statistics. That doesn't mean that you're going to win most of the time. Maybe you take a lot of bets, and you really only need to win once. But ultimately, if you're assigning these probabilities, you can almost guarantee that you're missing something. And the reason for this is because we tend to assign probabilities based on what we imagine could happen. We imagine that we know all of the possible outcomes, but this discounts a very large portion of outcomes that we never thought about at all. We're going to talk about a way to try to correct for this error in thinking right after we talk about today's sponsor. This episode of Developer T is brought to you by Square. There are millions of sellers across the globe using Square. You already know that because you've almost certainly bought something, spent money through Square. They're using it to run every aspect of their business, but you can come in and help them build custom solutions so they can integrate more deeply with their business in the first place. They're looking for these custom solutions, and that's your opportunity. You can build your business. You can grow your business by extending or integrating with Square using their free APIs and SDKs. These are tools that you can build for sellers. It's waiting for you at developert.com/square. This is a huge opportunity. developert.com/square. You can build these deeply connected tools, these custom solutions for sellers, millions of sellers across the globe. That's developert.com/square. Thanks again to Square for sponsoring today's episode of Developer T. The error in our thinking about the statistical likelihood, right, the probability that a given thing will happen, a given outcome will take place. Typically, we have an idea of the different categories of potential outcomes, but we often are wrong in sometimes minor, but often very large, major ways. This is especially true if the outcome depends on nuance. If it depends on, for example, what another human will decide to do. And many of our outcomes do indeed depend on this. For example, you could imagine having a conversation with a coworker and the intended outcome that you'd like to have and assigning a probability to that intended outcome. And then other outcomes that are not intended or other outcomes that are not ideal. you could assign those probabilities, and I'm guessing that most of the time, your probabilities come close. If you were to sum them all up, they come close to 100%. But the truth is, there's a very large array of options, of outcomes that are not in your list of predicted outcomes. In other words, you imagined a set of outcomes, but the list of all possible outcomes is much larger. And the ones that are not on your list deserve some level of probability. If they are possible, then they have some probability. Now, I want to be very clear here. It is not necessary to imagine every possible outcome. For many outcomes, the probability is so low that it's not necessarily worth considering. But this often becomes justification for imagining that the probability of all of those uncertain outcomes or unlikely outcomes is low enough to not consider at all. So here is an exercise to observe this in action. I want you to take a mental field trip. Try to remember what it was like to be you 10 years ago. Try to embody that for a second. Remember what you were listening to, what you were wearing, where you were, what a typical day looked like. Now, imagine the next 2 or 3 years. What did you think was going to happen? Where did you think you were going to go? What kind of job did you expect to take at that time? Or what kind of project did you think you were going to work on? Did you think you would progress faster or slower in your career than you did? For almost everyone listening to this show right now, the picture that you had 10 years ago of where your life would be even just 7 years ago was wildly inaccurate. Now, this will prove it even further. Imagine that same feeling of 10 years ago, trying to predict where you would be today. Where will you be in 10 years? Now, here is the proof at work. What is your confidence that you could predict where you would be today 10 years ago? In other words, if you could rewind time, not knowing anything about the last 10 years of your life, did the version of you 10 years ago accurately predict with any level of confidence what would happen in the next 10 years? Where would you be? Even what job do you have? It doesn't have to be every aspect of your life, but maybe just the 5 most important ones that kind of define what those 10 years looked like. Almost everyone that I've talked to that I do this exercise with answers that they could never have imagined where they are today 10 years ago. They never would have imagined that they listen to the music they listen to, that they participate in the hobbies that they're participating in, that they live in the kind of house or the kind of apartment, they own that particular kind of car. They never could have predicted it 10 years ago. Now, where will you be in 10 years from today? Do you have a higher confidence? This is the critical question. Do you have a higher confidence in your ability to predict where you'll be in 10 years from today than you have in your ability to predict 10 years ago where you would be now? In other words, do you think you've gotten better at this prediction? Setting aside the fact that we have a lot more variability in our younger years, let's say from age 18 to 28, than we might have from 28 to 38, there is still a large possibility of variation over the course of 10 years. And so if you have a drastically higher confidence in your current ability to predict the next 10 years than you have in your past self to be able to predict where you are today, then there's a mismatch. This is a very common bias that we have. We imagine that somehow our predictions of where we are now and where we're going are more informed, or we have more experience. Something has given us a better prediction engine today than we had before. This is why retrospective is so important to our work. This is why looking back on decisions that we've made and the outcomes that were generated from those decisions, it's why it is so critical. How often does an outcome surprise you? Amazingly, even this is a hard question to answer because we have such a sense-making bias. This is the tendency to make sense out of the world, that when we see an outcome, we post-rationalize. In other words, we look back and we draw conclusions about what we should have predicted. This changes whether or not we feel surprised about a given outcome. The only way to know for sure if we are telling the truth to ourselves, if we should say that we were surprised, is to look at those predictions. Take that list that you generated today and compare it to the real outcome. What you'll likely feel is that you should have predicted a given outcome based on your post-rationalization, but you didn't. For some reason, things didn't go as you expected them to go. If there's any takeaway that I want you to take from this episode, if there's anything I want you to remember, it's that the category of outcomes that you're not explicitly expecting is often much larger and much more likely than you could imagine. The possible outcomes, that category of potentials, this category is larger and more likely than you expect. Now, this has implications into how we make decisions in our daily lives. For example, if there's something that has a high potential for an uncertain outcome, if there's something that we don't know a lot about, it's a new decision, a new area that we've never explored, then maintaining flexibility has a higher premium. In other words, your ability to respond to an unexpected outcome, that becomes more important when there is a larger chance of the outcome being unexpected. Ultimately, we would all stand to benefit if we had a little less confidence in our ability to predict and a little more belief that unexpected things happen more often than, well, we expect. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode of Developer Tea. Thank you again to today's sponsor, Square. To get started with their SDKs and APIs for developers, head over to developertea.com/square. If you enjoyed this episode and you don't want to miss out on future episodes, make sure you subscribe in whatever podcasting app you're currently using. And if you want to join in on the conversation with other software engineers who are looking to improve in their lives and in their careers every day, head over to developertea.com/Discord. This is a Discord community that's totally free to join. There's no hooks. There's no catches to that. It's just a community of people who are improving on a daily basis, sharing their ideas, their questions, their stories with you. That's developertea.com/Discord. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, enjoy your tea.